The Philippine Sea, October 1944. The air itself seemed to vibrate with a new, terrifying frequency. It was not the roar of conventional aircraft engines, but a higher, desperate, and soul-chilling shriek. The pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy were no longer aiming their planes, they were aiming their funerals. This was the Kikusui, the floating chrysanthemum, the first organized waves of the Kamikaze. To the American sailors watching from the decks of the ships of Admiral William Bull Halsey's Third Fleet, it was a sight that defied all previous logic of warfare. Young men, some barely trained, were turning their aircraft into guided missiles, diving directly into the steel hulls of their ships. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. For months, the U.S. Navy had perfected a deadly dance of anti-aircraft warfare. They would throw up a wall of flak, black puffs of exploding shells from 5-inch guns, to break up formations at a distance. As the enemy planes drew closer, the faster-firing 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikon cannons would take over, filling the sky with a hail of steel, tracers arcing towards their targets in a desperate attempt to shoot them down before they could release bombs or torpedoes. It was a system of layered defense, and it had worked. But the Kamikaze changed the calculus. It removed the variables of a pilot's release point or pull-up. The entire aircraft was the point of impact. A plane could be riddled with bullets, its engine on fire, its pilot dead, and its sheer momentum would still carry it onto the flight deck of an aircraft carrier or the superstructure of a destroyer. The old tactics were suddenly obsolete. You didn't just need to hit a plane, you needed to obliterate it, to vaporize it in mid-air, far enough from the ship to render its deadly cargo harmless. The stress on the gunners was immense. They stood their ground, often in open mounts, as burning aircraft fell from the sky around them, the heat searing their skin, the sound of the engines a deafening scream of impending death. They fired until their barrels glowed red-hot, until the decks were carpeted in spent brass casings, but still the divine wind came. A new, cold fear settled over the fleet. They were facing an enemy that had redefined sacrifice. Their technology, their training, their courage, would it be enough against an opponent who saw death not as a risk, but as a duty? As the U.S. fleet steamed towards the ultimate showdown in the Leyte Gulf, the question hung in the salt-tinged air: how do you stop a weapon that is already dead? The answer was already being loaded into the hoists of their 5-inch guns. It was a secret that had been guarded more closely than the atomic bomb. A 3-pound, vacuum tube-filled brain that could think for itself. A shell that didn't need to hit you to kill you. A weapon the Japanese would never see coming, and would never understand. They called it the VT fuze. But the sailors who saw its work would give it another name: the Whispering Death. The problem of hitting a fast-moving aircraft with a shell from a rolling ship was one of the most complex mathematical and engineering challenges of the war. It was a problem of prediction, of calculating where the target would be when the shell arrived. But even with advanced radar-directed gunfire, a near miss was still a miss. A shell could pass within 50 feet of an aircraft and do nothing more than give the pilot a momentary scare. What was needed was a shell that could sense that near miss and correct for it. A shell that could, in effect, think. The concept was audacious: miniaturize a complete radio set, with a transmitter, a receiver, and a power source, small enough to fit in the nose of an artillery shell, and rugged enough to survive being fired from a naval gun at 20,000 gs of force. To the engineers of the time, it sounded like science fiction. The solution was born in a secretive laboratory, Section T, established at the Carnegie Institution in Washington, D.C. Their mission was to turn fiction into reality. The heart of the VT, variable time, fuse was a tiny radio transceiver. As the shell spun towards its target, it would continuously broadcast a radio signal. If it passed close to a solid object like an aircraft, the signal would be reflected back. The Doppler shift, the change in frequency as the shell and target moved relative to each other, would be detected by the fuse's circuitry. When the reflected signal reached a certain strength, indicating the target was at the optimal kill radius, a capacitor would discharge, sending an electrical current to a detonator, which would then explode the shell. It was breathtakingly elegant. The shell now had its own eyes. It didn't care about the roll of the ship or the evasive action of the pilot. It simply measured the distance to death and decided when to embrace it. The engineering hurdles were monumental. Vacuum tubes, the standard electronic components of the era, were fragile glass bulbs. To make them survive the violent acceleration of being fired, engineers developed tubes with wire filaments as thin as a human hair, supported not by a glass base, but by their own internal structure. They were packed in a shock-absorbing resin. The batteries to power the system had to be activated by the spin of the shell. The entire assembly had to be produced by the millions on assembly lines staffed largely by women, whose meticulous work was crucial to the project's success. The secrecy surrounding the fuse was absolute. It was considered the second most important secret of the war, after the Manhattan Project. Use of the fuse was initially forbidden over land, for fear a dud would be recovered by the enemy and its technology reverse-engineered. It was a weapon reserved for the one battlefield where duds would be lost forever, the vast, deep ocean. As the kamikaze threat emerged in late 1944, the strategic calculus changed. The survival of the fleet was at stake. The order was given. Release the VT fuse to the fleet. The shells, crated and labeled with innocuous codes, were shipped to the Pacific. They arrived without fanfare, just another piece of ammunition. The gunners who loaded them had no idea they were handling a revolution. They were about to unleash a storm of intelligent shrapnel, a cloud of death that could think. The stage was set for the greatest naval battle in history, and at its heart would be a 3-pound bundle of wires and glass that would change the nature of combat forever. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, unfolding over 4 days in October 1944, was a sprawling, chaotic masterpiece of naval strategy and raw combat. It was the anvil upon which the Japanese Navy would be broken. The American plan was twofold. General Douglas MacArthur's forces would land on the island of Leyte, fulfilling his promise to return, while Admiral Halsey's powerful Third Fleet and Admiral Kinkaid's smaller Seventh Fleet would protect the invasion from the inevitable Japanese counterattack. The Japanese plan, SHO-1, was a final, desperate gamble. They would use their few remaining aircraft carriers as a decoy to lure Halsey's formidable Task Force 38 away from the San Bernardino Strait. Once Halsey was drawn north, 2 powerful Japanese surface forces, the Center Force, including the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, and the Southern Force, would punch through the straits and fall upon the vulnerable American landing forces and their escorting escort carriers, the Jeep carriers. It was a plan of breathtaking audacity, and it very nearly worked. Halsey took the bait, steaming north with his fast carriers to destroy the Japanese decoy force. This left the San Bernardino Strait unguarded. As night fell on October 24, the massive center force, led by the Yamato, slipped through the strait undetected and turned south. Their target, Taffy 3, a group of 6 slow escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. The morning of October 25, 1944, dawned on a scene of surreal and terrifying disparity. The tiny ships of Taffy 3 found themselves facing the largest battleship ever built and an entire fleet of cruisers and destroyers. It was a fight that, on paper, should have lasted minutes. The American destroyers, the USS Johnston, Hull, and Heermann, launched a suicidal torpedo attack against the Japanese line, charging into a storm of 18-inch shells. The escort carriers, their flight decks crammed with planes armed for ground attack, launched everything they had, making dry runs without bombs or torpedoes to harass the Japanese fleet. The sky was a maelstrom of shell splashes, smoke, and chaos. And into this chaos, the kamikazes came. As the surface battle raged, Japanese land-based aircraft from Clark Field began their own death dives on the American carriers. It was at this moment, at the absolute crisis point of the battle, that the whispering death was unleashed in earnest. Aboard the escort carriers and their screening destroyers, the 5-inch guns began to bark. But this time, the results were different. Instead of the black puffs of flak appearing behind the diving planes, they began to blossom around them. A kamikaze would be in its dive, committed and unstoppable, and then simply vanish in a perfect, violent sphere of flame and shrapnel. One shell, one kill. The psychological effect was instantaneous and twofold. For the American gunners, it was a moment of stunned, ecstatic disbelief. They were no longer spraying the sky in hope, they were sniping aircraft out of it with terrifying efficiency. For the Japanese pilots, it was a descent into a new kind of hell. Their divine wind was meeting a man-made thunderstorm that seemed to have a malevolent intelligence. They were being destroyed by an invisible hand before they could even see their target clearly. The ferocity of the American defense, both on the surface, the success at Leyte Gulf was merely the opening act. As the American fleet pushed closer to the Japanese home islands in 1945, the kamikaze attacks intensified into a storm of steel and fire. The skies off Okinawa, Iwo Jima, and Formosa became a killing field. But now, the U.S. Navy was ready. The VT fuze, once a secret weapon, was now integrated into the very fabric of the fleet's air defense. The 5-inch gun batteries, guided by advanced radar fire control systems that could track multiple targets, became the anvil upon which the kamikaze charges were broken. The procedure was brutally efficient. A radar operator would pick up a blip, bogey, dozens of miles out. The fire control computer would calculate the target's course and speed. Then, the gun directors would lock on. When the range closed to several thousand yards, the gunners would open fire. But this was not the wild barrage of old. This was a precise, calculated slaughter. The first VT fused shell would often be the last. Sailors described the eerie, new reality of anti-aircraft warfare. A Japanese plane would be spotted, a speck on the horizon growing rapidly. The 5-inch guns would fire a few rounds, their deep-throated crump a familiar sound. Then, without warning, the diving aircraft would simply cease to exist. It would not trail smoke, it would not spiral, it would not break apart. It would be replaced by a perfectly round, orange-black fireball, from which a rain of tiny, burning debris would fall into the sea. The sound that followed was not a bang, but a sharp, concussive crack that carried over the water, the sound of the whispering death. The kill ratios skyrocketed. Where it had once taken an average of hundreds of shells to down a single aircraft, a handful of VT-fused rounds could now destroy an entire formation. The psychological impact on the American sailors was transformative. The cold dread of the unstoppable kamikaze began to thaw. A new, grim confidence took hold. They were no longer just victims waiting for a blow, they were hunters, armed with a weapon that gave them a decisive edge. The gunners, who had once fired until their arms ached and their ears bled, now worked with a chilling economy of motion. Load, fire, watch the sky clear. The constant, screaming tension was replaced by a focused, professional rhythm. The fleet had developed an immune system, and the VT fuse was its white blood cell, seeking out and destroying the infection of the divine wind with ruthless, automated precision. The sea around the American task forces became a graveyard of Japanese aircraft, a testament to the silent revolution happening inside the shells that filled their skies. The storm of steel was now a thinking storm, and it was a storm the Japanese could not weather. For the Japanese pilots and their commanders, the new American anti-aircraft fire was a phenomenon they could not explain. It defied all their experience and training. Before late 1944, a skilled pilot had a chance. He could weave, jink, and dive through the barrages of flak, knowing that the shells had to score a direct hit or a very near miss to be effective. But now, the rules of the game had changed. The sky itself had become lethal. Pilots reported that the American ships seemed surrounded by an invisible shield. They would be lining up for their final dive, the target growing in their windscreen, and then their world would end in a flash of light and shrapnel. There was no warning, no visible tracer to dodge, just instantaneous annihilation. The few pilots who survived encounters with the new flak returned with bewildering reports. They spoke of shells that followed them, or of explosions that happened seemingly at random in empty air around them. The concept of a radio proximity fuse was so advanced, so far outside Japanese technological understanding at that stage of the war, that it was never seriously considered. Japanese intelligence analysts concocted other theories. They suspected the Americans had developed a form of death ray, or directed energy weapon. Others believed the flak bursts were being triggered by wires strung between balloons, or by some new, supersensitive contact fuse. The truth was far simpler, and far more terrifying: the Americans had learned to make steel think. The psychological effect on the Kamikaze Corps was devastating. Their entire tactic was built on the principle of unstoppable sacrifice. But now, that sacrifice was being rendered meaningless. They were being destroyed before they could even become martyrs. The divine wind was being stopped by a man-made gale of intelligent shrapnel. This bred a new kind of fear, one that was deeper and more insidious than the fear of death. It was the fear of irrelevance. Could it be that their ultimate sacrifice, the highest honor a warrior could aspire to, was now being negated by a technological trick? Morale, which had been fanatical, began to show cracks. Some pilots, in their final radio transmissions, expressed not defiance, but confusion and despair. The American sailors, listening in on these transmissions, heard the change. The screams of "Banzai" were sometimes replaced by cries of shock or simple, final curses. The "whispering death" was not just killing aircraft, it was killing an ideology. It was demonstrating, in the most violent terms possible, that no amount of human spirit could compete with the relentless engine of American industrial and scientific innovation. The Japanese Navy was being broken not just by superior numbers, but by a superior understanding of the future of war itself. The story of the VT fuse is not just one of battlefield brilliance, but of industrial might. The arsenal of democracy did not just produce vast quantities of tanks and ships, it produced miracles of microengineering by the millions. The mass production of the VT fuse was a logistical and manufacturing feat that rivaled the building of the Liberty ships. The fuses had to be assembled by hand, a task that required the steady hands and sharp eyes of thousands of workers, most of them women. They worked in cleanroom environments, handling components so delicate that a static spark could ruin them. Each tiny glass tube, each minute wire, had to be soldered and placed with absolute precision. These were not munitions workers handling blocks of TNT, they were assemblers of the world's first smart weapons. The factories hummed 24 hours a day, their output a closely guarded secret. The components were sourced from hundreds of subcontractors across the United States, all of whom were kept in the dark about the final product. A factory in Ohio might be producing a special resin, while one in California manufactured the ruggedized vacuum tubes, and another in New York assembled the final product. This decentralized, high-security production line was a testament to American industrial organization. By 1945, over 22 million VT fuses had been produced. They were not just for the Navy's 5-inch guns. The technology was adapted for Army artillery, where it was used with devastating effect against German troops in the Battle of the Bulge, creating airbursts over foxholes that no soldier could hide from. But its finest hour was at sea. The ability to produce such a complex device in such staggering numbers gave the U.S. Navy a qualitative advantage that no amount of Japanese zeal could overcome. Every shell hoisted into a 5-inch gun mount was a product of this vast, hidden effort. It represented the work of a physicist in a Washington lab, an engineer in a Michigan factory, and a Rosie the Riveter on an assembly line in New York. The "whispering death" was the distilled essence of the American war effort: brains, brawn, and an unwavering commitment to winning the war of production. While Japan was sacrificing its pilots, America was mobilizing its intellect and its industrial base. The outcome of this clash was inevitable. The VT fuse was the perfect symbol of this disparity, a weapon so advanced it seemed like magic, yet so commonplace that it was fired by the crate load. It was the sound of American industry, whispering death from the sky. The final months of the Pacific War saw the Kamikaze campaign reach its desperate, bloody zenith. Operation Tengo, the last major Japanese naval action, was a suicide mission centered around the super battleship Yamato, sent on a one-way trip to Okinawa to beach itself and fight as a static fortress. While the Yamato was ultimately sunk by conventional aerial attack, the skies around Okinawa became the true focal point of the final battle. Here, the kamikaze attacks were more numerous and coordinated than ever before. They came in massive waves, the Kikusui, floating chrysanthemum, attacks, sometimes involving hundreds of aircraft. The goal was simple: overwhelm the American defenses through sheer numbers, hoping enough planes would get through to cripple the fleet supporting the invasion. But the American fleet had evolved into a floating fortress of anti-aircraft warfare. Ships were now layered in a defensive grid, with picket destroyers stationed dozens of miles out to provide early warning. These destroyers, the picket line, bore the brunt of the attacks, and their logs from this period read like chronicles from hell. They fought off dozens of attacks a day, their guns firing until the barrels glowed. And at the heart of this defense was the relentless, efficient work of the VT fuze. The statistics from the Battle of Okinawa tell a stark story. During the months-long campaign, nearly 1,500 kamikaze planes managed to crash into Allied ships, causing tremendous damage and loss of life. However, an estimated 3,000 more were shot down before they could reach their targets. The majority of these kills were credited to the combined efforts of naval gunfire, much of it using the VT fuze, and carrier-based fighters. The effectiveness of the 5-inch guns equipped with the smart fuse was so high that it fundamentally altered Japanese tactics. Pilots were ordered to fly at lower altitudes, below the effective range of the larger guns, only to be met by the withering fire of 40mm and 20mm batteries. They tried evasive maneuvers, but against a shell that detonated at the optimal distance, evasion was nearly impossible. The sky had become a unified kill zone. The psychological toll on the Japanese was immense. They were sending their best remaining young pilots on missions where the chance of even reaching a target was less than 50%. The whispering death had turned their ultimate weapon into a costly, inefficient statistic. The divine wind was being met by a technological typhoon, and it was a storm the Japanese could not weather. The final onslaught proved two things: the fanatical determination of the Japanese military, and the cold, hard fact that determination alone could not stand against the When the guns fell silent in August 1945, the full impact of the VT fuze began to be understood, though its story remained largely classified for years. The whispering death had been one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war, and for good reason. Its revelation would have signaled a new era in warfare, one where electronics could guide destruction with terrifying efficiency. In the immediate aftermath, the strategic implications were clear. The fuse had saved the U.S. Navy from a threat that could have prolonged the war indefinitely. The kamikaze, if left unchecked, could have made the cost of invading the Japanese home islands prohibitively high, both in ships and in American lives. By neutralizing this threat, the VT fuze not only saved the fleet at Leyte Gulf and Okinawa but also made the eventual invasion of Japan a more feasible, if still horrific, prospect. Some historians have argued that the fuse, along with the atomic bomb, was a key factor in convincing the Japanese leadership of the futility of continued resistance. They were not just facing overwhelming force, but an enemy whose technological prowess seemed limitless. How could they fight an enemy whose very shells could think? For the Japanese military leaders who were briefed on the technology after the war, the truth was a humiliating revelation. Their failure to deduce the nature of the weapon spoke volumes about the technological gap that had opened between the two nations. They had attributed their losses to superior American numbers or spirit, never imagining that the answer lay in a tiny radio set inside a shell. The fuse's success also had a profound effect on post-war military doctrine. It cemented the role of electronics and radar in modern warfare. The concept of smart munitions was born not in the deserts of Iraq in the 1990s, but in the skies over the Pacific in 1944. To understand the true value of the VT fuse, one must consider the stark arithmetic of what might have been. Without it, the Kamikaze campaign would have been far more effective. Historians estimate that the fuse improved the effectiveness of anti-aircraft fire by a factor of 5 to 7. This seemingly dry statistic translates into a staggering human reality. If the kill rate against kamikazes had remained at pre-VT fuse levels, the number of ships hit and sunk during the battles of Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa would have been catastrophic. The tiny escort carriers of Taffy 3 might have been wiped out. The fleet off Okinawa might have been decimated, potentially jeopardizing the entire invasion. The loss of life among American sailors, gunners, pilots, deck crews, would have been exponentially higher. The fuse did not make the kamikaze threat disappear. The battle reports and memorials from 1945 are filled with the names of ships that were hit and sailors who were lost. But it turned a potential war-losing threat into a manageable, if still deadly, tactical problem. It gave the gunners a fighting chance. For every plane that was vaporized by a whispering death shell miles from the fleet, that was one less fire to fight on a flight deck, one less explosion in a hangar bay, one less ship sent to the bottom with hundreds of men. The fuse saved not just ships, but the morale of the fleet. It replaced a sense of helplessness with one of empowered defiance. The men on the ships were no longer just targets, they were active participants in their own defense, wielding a weapon that matched the technological sophistication of their enemy's desperation. This psychological victory was as important as the tactical one. The American sailor, armed with the VT fuse, stood his ground not just with courage, but with the confidence that science was on his side. The whispering death was therefore more than a weapon, it was a shield. It was the product of a nation's collective brainpower, designed to protect its sons from a terrifying new form of warfare. It represented the ultimate expression of the arsenal of democracy, not just producing weapons of destruction, but producing tools of preservation. It saved a navy, it saved an invasion, and it saved countless lives, all by adding a 3-pound brain to a 5-inch shell. The story of the whispering death shells is a story of a hidden turning point. While the world remembers the great naval battles of the Pacific, Midway, Leyte Gulf, the Coral Sea, the silent revolution happening inside the gun barrels of the fleet remained a secret. Yet, its impact was as decisive as any admiral's order or pilot's bravery. It was the moment when warfare evolved from an art of ballistics to a science of electronics. The echo of that first VT fuse detonation over Leyte Gulf can be heard in every modern smart weapon system. It established the principle that the future of combat would be guided by miniaturized electronics, by sensors and fuses that could make life-or-death decisions in milliseconds. The technological lineage is direct and unbroken, from the vacuum tubes of the VT fuse to the transistors in a Sidewinder missile, to the microchips in a modern drone. The engineers of Section T had not just solved a military problem, they had opened a new chapter in human conflict. For the Japanese Navy, the whispering death was the final, incomprehensible blow. They had entered the war believing in the supremacy of the human spirit, the Yamato Damashii. They ended it facing an enemy whose spirit was amplified by a technology they could not replicate or even fully understand. It was a demonstration of power far more profound than the atomic bomb, for it was a power that was used daily, routinely, to systematically dismantle their last, most desperate strategy. The kamikaze was the samurai sword, the VT fuse was the machine gun. The outcome of that clash was a foregone conclusion. Today, the VT fuse sits in museums, a curious relic of a bygone era. But its legacy is alive. It serves as a permanent testament to the power of innovation,